sequel to How and Why to Cite. This one is about writing clear, concise, well-structured essays. It's aimed mainly at first-year students and at upper-year students who sometimes have felt their grades didn't really reflect their effort or their knowledge, and that's a common problem. I remember when I started university, I was a bit surprised at first that my grades were average at best at first, because I did the readings, I felt like I understood everything, and I know I gave it a good effort, so why was I struggling to reach maybe the low end of a B? It's because I didn't know how to write for academia, and once I figured that out, my grades improved, and now as an instructor, I do my best to help my students avoid the same mistakes that I made, so that's what this video is all about. The video doesn't cover everything you need to know about writing essays, because that would be a very long video that I don't have time to make. It's also because anybody watching this probably already knows something about writing essays, so I don't think I need to start from the very beginning. Instead, it's a compilation of the most common bits of feedback and advice that I've written on papers over the years, and I'm putting it all together in this video to help people avoid making those mistakes in the first place. I'm going to start with a brief review of some of the points I covered in my last instructional, the How and Why to Cite video. In that one, I described writing for a university course as like being a part of a conversation. Any course, especially in the social sciences, involves reading publications that were written by specialists who for the most part are writing for each other. They're sharing their knowledge with each other, and undergraduate students aren't usually the intended audience of an academic journal article or an academic volume. So you're not expected to, contribute to the conversation in that same way, which might sound patronizing, but it has nothing to do with anybody's ability. It's just about the nature of the work that you're doing in the conversation. I mean, of course, it would be unrealistic and unfair to expect students in an undergraduate course to write a full-length journal article as an assignment in like a second-year undergrad course. It wouldn't make sense. So the role of undergrads, based on where you're at in the system, is in this conversation is consuming some of the knowledge from those peer-reviewed sources, exploring its relevance and its limitations, and showing your instructor in that course that you've done that through your own work in the course, which is why before you do any writing, you need to read all the sources carefully, take notes, come up with a plan, because your essay is really about the sources. It's not about your opinion you had on the topic before you took the course. It's about what you're doing with the sources that you've been assigned and the ones that you found on your own. Citing is covered at length in that last video, so I won't go over that in much detail. I'm just going to review the main purpose of citing. So as I said last time, it's to give credit where credit is due, giving credit to the authors of the work you consulted to make your own points. And it's also giving credit to yourself. It's showing the reader, who is almost always your instructor, of course, it's showing your instructor that the points that you're making are supported by the findings of legit peer-reviewed research by a specialist. I'll also repeat that in university papers, every idea, every piece of data that you get from someone else's work, it needs to be cited, whether it's in your own words or quoted directly. It must be cited with a page number citation, and that's all covered in my last video, How and Why to Cite. Continuing from this idea of a conversation, an essay question is basically your instructor asking you to contribute a specific piece to the conversation, and you're being graded in that assignment not just on how good your essay is, but also on how close that essay comes to contributing the piece of the conversation that you were asked to contribute. So to bring this all to life, to make some more sense of it, I'm going to use one example of one of my old undergraduate papers. So this is something I wrote for a course way back in 2002, but the standards are pretty much the same through the years. This was for a second-year course in the anthropology of the media. And I chose this one because I did well, but not excellent. It got me the low end of an A, so not amazing, but very good. The question I chose to answer, there was 5 or 6 questions to choose from, and I copied out the one that I chose verbatim on the title page, which is usually a good thing to do unless you're told not to. The question was, explore the relationship between a minority group and the media. Is the relationship one of oppression, liberation, or negotiation? Discuss with examples. So it's a very broad question, and I could have gone about it in many different ways. It asked me to write about any minority group, so that could be an ethnic minority, a religious minority, a sexual minority, a group defined by disability, many other possibilities. And then there are some words in the question that get a bit more theoretical. It asks, is the relationship one of oppression, liberation, or negotiation? So again, this video is not about the content, it's about how to structure an essay, but I'll just go through these terms quickly and then we'll get down to how to structure a response to this. Oppression, liberation, or negotiation. Well, I think oppression is obvious. That would mean that the media in this case is somehow contributing to the fact that this minority group faces discrimination that puts members of that group at a real disadvantage. And just as an aside, there's lots of research illustrating how that is the case. Research on how bad media coverage of a particular group is not just offensive, it is that, but it's more than that. It also really disadvantages people in a real material way. So that's what, oppression by the media would refer to. Liberation is an interesting one. Does the media coverage somehow help this minority group in their efforts to free themselves from the effects of that discrimination? I guess that could look like editorials that supported marriage equality when that was up for debate, or more recently, coverage that was sympathetic to the protests against systemic racism and police violence over the past couple of months. The third one in this question is negotiation, which is basically a blend of those first two. Does the media contribute to oppression in some cases and to liberation in others? Are there ways that people within that minority group have strategized to get sympathetic coverage, even though the media was usually hostile to them? There's lots of possibilities for answering the question in that way. So again, I'm not going to say much about the content. The point is, there were many ways I could have answered that question, and they all could have been equally good for the sake of this assignment, as long as they actually answered the question. I needed to talk about the relationship between a minority group and the media, and I had to argue whether that relationship was about oppression, liberation, or negotiation. It's a very big target, and I just need to hit it somewhere near the middle. So here are some examples of arguments that aren't really on target but would count for something, but not a great mark. The first example is not having an argument at all. Don't do this. Some people do this just because they ran out of time and they wanted to get some marks. If that's what you've been doing, I can't really help you with that. You just need to work on your time management skills. Other people do this because, well, they were so badly served by their high school teachers that they don't know that essays need an argument. So I'm here to say essays always need an argument, aka a thesis. There's some examples of, literature review assignments or shorter papers that aren't essays that don't need arguments, but if it's called an essay, it needs an argument 100%. The whole point of an essay is to demonstrate that you've learned the material well enough to make a logical argument based on it. It's nowhere near enough to just put together some paragraphs that restate what some of the lectures in the course said about your topic and a couple of quotes from the readings. Doing just that with no argument might get you a D+ at best from a very generous instructor. Another example of what not to do. I could have written some kind of a paper arguing that crime coverage in a particular newspaper is racist, and that would be a valid point because there's plenty of examples of that. I could write a very good essay proving that, but if that's all the essay did, I'd be lucky to get a C+, no matter how well written it was, because that would be off target. It does not answer the whole question. It just says the coverage is racist. There's nothing about the relationship between a particular minority group and the media, and nothing about oppression, liberation, or negotiation. This one is a very common mistake. There's these off-target arguments that address some of the question, but not all of it, and you only get credit for how much of the actual question your paper addresses. Another example along the same lines could be an essay about homophobia in general, for example. And somewhere in that essay, it does talk about the media. Maybe it talks about homophobic jokes in movies or sitcoms or something. This would be kind of relevant and entirely valid. It's a valid argument. There's lots of data to support it. But it's not completely relevant to the question. It does talk about a minority group. It does say something about the media, but it doesn't actually answer the question. It doesn't tell me about that relationship. It does not comment on oppression, liberation, or negotiation. So again, at best, this is a C+, more likely a C. So here's an example of an on-target argument. It's not a great argument, but it's on target. It was enough to get me a low A. This is the argument of the paper that I'm using as my example from an undergraduate paper that I wrote way back in 2002. The argument goes, based on an analysis of deaf president now and the way it was portrayed by local mainstream media, I argue that deaf people are a minority group whose relationship with the media is primarily one of negotiation. And I resisted the urge to edit this. This is word for word what I wrote in a second-year Anthrop course many years ago. Now I'll walk you through some of the highlights of this paper and how I put it together. So I'm not going to say much about the actual content because this video is about the process of structuring and editing an essay, but I will say a bit about it just to help the structuring lesson make more sense, and also because it's an important and interesting topic. So the paper I'm using as an example is about Deaf President Now, which was a student protest movement that happened at Gallaudet University in 1988. So for those who don't know, Gallaudet is a university for deaf and hard of hearing students located in Washington, D.C. At that point, when this movement took place in the late 1980s, the university, the school, was already well over a century old. It served deaf and hard of hearing students, and it had never had a deaf president. This had long been a problem for many students and other deaf individuals, because the bigger context is this long history of paternalism and discrimination against deaf people. And then in 1988, the job for president was open, and a hearing candidate was given the job over a number of highly qualified deaf applicants. So some students decided, in that moment, enough was enough, and they launched this massive protest movement called Deaf President Now. And it worked. After a little less than a week, I think it was, the hearing president resigned, and a deaf president of the university was appointed. So that's just a nutshell, the very basic outline of what happened. It's a very important part of history, and I recommend everyone take the time to educate themselves on this. I knew nothing about it myself until I got to know some deaf individuals through a job I had at the time. They told me a bit about it. I wanted to learn more about it, so I used this assignment as an opportunity to read more about something I wanted to read more about anyway. Which is another piece of advice that I have for everybody watching this video, is to use your assignments as a chance to indulge your own curiosity wherever possible, especially in these kind of open-ended assignments like the one that I'm describing. Because even if it's a course that you're not especially excited about, even if you don't like writing essays most of the time, many essay questions are so open-ended that they can be made into opportunities to read up on something you've always wanted to read more about anyway. If your topic that you have in mind seems like a bit of a stretch, then ask your instructor, but in many cases, you might have more flexibility than you think, and in many cases, what really matters is that your essay makes a clear argument that actually answers the questions. So you can kind of go with whatever you're interested in, whatever you want to learn more about a lot of the time. But back to the argument. This was the argument of the paper. This is word for word what I wrote. I wrote based on an analysis of Deaf President Now and the way it was portrayed by local mainstream media. I argue that deaf people are a minority group whose relationship with the media is primarily one of negotiation. So this argument is completely on target. It's about the relationship between a minority group, deaf people, and the media, and it makes an argument in response to the question. That question, again, was the relationship between that group and the media, and I'm arguing that it's one of negotiation, mainly, out of those three options. So like I said, this got me a low A. It's a very good argument, but it's not an excellent argument. So here are some things that I could have done differently. I could have made it a lot more nuanced and complicated. For one, I'm making an argument about deaf people in general by the wording of this argument, but it's not really a study of, all deaf people everywhere. It's a study of a protest movement that was led by deaf students at a university in 1988. So the argument should have been more clear about what I was actually talking about. My argument is actually a lot more specific than this statement kind of lets on. I could have said some more complicated and interesting things about deaf culture and identity. Deafness is often thought about through the lens of disability, but according to many deaf individuals and organizations, it's a linguistic and a cultural group, and also a very diverse and complex one, just like any linguistic and cultural group. My argument doesn't really get at that complexity, but it does answer the question, and it does make sense. It's just a bit too simplified and too matter-of-fact. So I think that's why it got me a low A and not a high A, and it's certainly nowhere near an A+. Now I want to fast forward to the bibliography, just so I can make this one point. To make the argument completely on target, it needs to cite at least some material from the course that you're writing this paper for. In this case, this was my one source from the course outline, this one that's highlighted, Discourses of Domination by Henry and Tater. Again, again, this was for a course on the anthropology of the media. The course had nothing to do with Deaf President Now or with deaf culture. The course wasn't even focused on minority groups and their relationships with the media. So there's nothing on the syllabus that's specifically about my topic, but there is lots on the syllabus that was relevant to my topic, such as this book that I just mentioned. The full title is Discourses of Domination, Racial Bias in the Canadian English Language Press. Even though it's about a different topic, it's on the syllabus, and there has to be something in that book that could help me think about the relationship between another minority group and another segment of the media. So this is one important way in which I made this paper on target. I took some ideas from one piece of course material and applied it to my topic, even though that topic did not appear anywhere in the course. In retrospect, I could have done a bit of a better job on this. Citing one source for the syllabus is pretty good, but 2 or 3 would have been better. But always check your assignment instructions. There might be some specific requirements on how many sources from the syllabus to use versus how many outside sources. And if you're unsure, always ask. But in general, I recommend citing at least a couple of sources from the syllabus of the course for which you're writing this essay. The rest of the sources on this bibliography are ones that I found on my own research. Some are peer-reviewed academic sources, which I talk more about in my last instructional. And some of these are newspaper articles, which normally you shouldn't use. You shouldn't normally rely on mainstream media sources in an academic paper. But because this essay involved critiquing the media, it's a bit of a different assignment. So that's why I cited all these Washington Post articles. More on those in a bit. Last point on bibliographies, like I said in my last instructional, the first thing I look at when I grade a paper is the bibliography. I go right to the last page to look at the bibliography to make sure the paper cites the right number of sources, including the right number of sources from the course syllabus. I make sure the sources are all peer-reviewed. That alone accounts for a large part of the grades in the papers in my courses, and I also make sure it's formatted properly to get a sense of, the level of care and effort and interest that was put into this piece. So again, there was one source on that list that was from the syllabus, which is okay, but not great. More would have been better. The thing that I pulled from that one source was the methods those authors used, and that method was critical discourse analysis. Again, I'm not going to say much about the content, but just to go through this quickly, critical discourse analysis is about taking a close look at the vocabulary that's used, usually in media sources, the vocabulary used to portray groups of people, and that's done in order to study, a quote from that source, how social power, dominance, and inequality are produced, reproduced, and resisted by text and talk in the social and political arenas of society. So that's straight from that source that I quoted, Henry and Tater, 2002. So those authors in that source use that approach of critical discourse analysis to study racist newspaper articles about ethnic minorities in Canada in the 1990s. So that's not directly relevant to my topic, but I borrowed their approach and I used it to study coverage of a student protest in the USA in the 1980s. And that was a good move because I gave them credit through a proper citation, which again is covered in detail in my last instructional, How and Why to Cite. Now back to the argument. So I've argued that the relationship between deaf people and the media in this case was one of negotiation. So that's the easy part, is just saying that. The hard part is now proving it, right? And that's the main point of the essay. So there's tons that I could have said about this, but a typical undergraduate paper is usually 10 pages long at most. This one was a bit longer. It was about 15 pages. Fourth year term papers might be about 20 pages long. But no matter the length, you are never going to cover all aspects of a topic in any one paper, not just in undergrad, but at any level of study. And nobody expects that of you. At least they shouldn't expect you to cover everything about a topic in one paper. The assignment is just to craft a logical argument based on a reasonable amount of data. And to do that well, you need some structure. I recommend getting this in place before you actually start writing. And this has been my biggest source of frustration, I guess, as an instructor since 2004, is that one of the most useful things that many people learned in high school is the very thing that they are most often told not to do. And what I'm talking about is the idea behind the high school 5-paragraph essay. So I'm sure everybody's seen this, the structure of the 5-paragraph essay from high school. The first paragraph is the introduction. It says a bit about the context, and then it says what the argument is, which is in the form of a thesis statement. So that's paragraph 1. Paragraph 2 provides one piece of evidence that supports that argument. Paragraph 3 provides another piece of evidence, and paragraph 4 provides yet another piece of evidence. And then paragraph 5 is a brief wrap up of how you prove your argument, and that's the end of the paper. 5 paragraphs. It's not exactly deep, not very interesting, but it did the job in high school. And then many people get to university and get told not to do the high school 5-paragraph essay anymore because it's for high school and it's too simple, which it is. I'm not saying anybody should ever do a 5-paragraph essay in a university course. It is too short. It is too simple. But the problem is people get told to forget about that structure, and then they aren't given a better structure to replace it, so they end up with just no structure, and that's never a good thing. So here's what I always recommend. Nobody is writing 5-paragraph essays in university, or they shouldn't be, but it's still a good idea to come up with 3 main points that you will use to support your overall argument. In a university paper, you just need to write more than 1 paragraph on each of those points. So this is where structure comes in. At this stage, you have an argument that answers the question, and it relies on at least some course material. You have your external peer-reviewed sources that you found, and you've read them and taken notes on them. And now you need to organize all that theory and data and information into a 10 or 15 page or so document that answers your question. Now, if you don't structure that in advance, it will probably be a mess, and you probably won't do any better than, like a C+. So my advice is to use the idea of the 5-paragraph essay, but take it up many levels to a university standard. So that starts by coming up with 3 main points that you will use to support your argument. Each one of those points needs to be provable by using the material that you have on hand, and each one of those points also needs to help you prove your overall argument. So here's how I did that in this paper, which again is not a 5-paragraph essay. I counted it, and it's actually a 35-paragraph essay. It was the longest assignment in a second-year course. 15 pages is on the long end of undergraduate assignments, but it's structured pretty much like a 5-paragraph essay. It starts with an argument, it then has 3 main points, and then a conclusion. So my 3 main points that support that argument, that the relationship between deaf people and the media in Washington in 1988 was about negotiation. My 3 main points to support that, I've summarized these with these 3 subheadings. The first one is the media creating news. The second one is critical discourse analysis. And the third one is negotiating media coverage. So again, the paper begins with an intro, which in this case was about 2 pages long. Each of those next 3 sections, each focuses on 1 point, and each of those is between 3 and 4 pages long. And then there is a concluding section of roughly a page. So again, very similar structure to a 5-paragraph essay, but it's just longer and more detailed and better written. So I'm going to show you the first paragraph of each of these sections as examples of how to structure a paper. So here's the first paragraph of the first main section of the paper, not the introduction, but the first substantive section that I called the media creating news. I'll just read this paragraph and then explain what I did with it and what works and what could have been done better. I wrote, "From here, I will discuss 2 moments in the timeline in which the media's role played an important part in shaping the course of daily events. These moments are examples of, quote, the media creating news. By simply being there, the media influenced the direction of deaf President Now in ways that were mostly favorable to the protesters. These moments were usually inadvertent, as the goal of the media is to report a version of the truth and not to support protests. This illustrates that the relationship between the deaf community of Gallaudet and the mainstream media was one of negotiation. The media did not go to Gallaudet to be an ally of the protesters, but by negotiating with media conventions, the protesters drew on the media as a tool of support." I think I did a pretty good job with this one. It's an argument in and of itself. It's arguing that the media did not set out that week to go support the protesters. And in general, the media is, part of the hearing establishment that oppresses deaf people. But just by showing up, the media helped the cause, whether or not individual reporters wanted to. So that's the intro to that section. I then prove that point in 4 paragraphs that follow. So if you're curious, those 2 events that I mentioned, the first one was media coverage in the beginnings of the protest, when the media made the protest look serious to your average viewer just by being there. And the other moment was this national TV broadcast in the United States where they had a panel discussion about the protests, and the panel included the hearing president of the university who had been appointed and one of the protest organizers. So on that broadcast, the host seemed to be doing his best to, kind of call it down the middle, as the media is expected to do in these situations. So, neutral media coverage. But in the process, the hearing president, who people wanted replaced, that person said some especially cringeworthy things. So basically, just by putting a camera on that person, a major media outlet supported the protest that night. So that was the two examples that supported this one point, which in turn supports the thesis of the whole paper. The second main section of that paper is the one that I called Critical Discourse Analysis. So again, I'll just read the first paragraph of this one and explain what I did with it. It goes, "From here, I will conduct a critical discourse analysis of 10 Washington Post articles covering the events of Deaf President Now. I will argue that though the coverage was supportive of the protesters' demands, it was also marked by subtle paternalism towards Deaf President Now and deaf people in general. This shows that the relationship between the deaf community of Gallaudet and the media was primarily one of negotiation, in that the deaf protesters engaged with paternalistic reporters and were able to generate coverage that supported the goals of Deaf President Now." So obviously there were many more than 10 articles published about that week-long protest, and there were many more media outlets than just the Washington Post that covered the protest. But again, I'm not expected to cover everything in an undergraduate paper. If it was a PhD dissertation or if it was a peer-reviewed journal article, then I would indeed have to read every article published about the protest that week or even over a longer period. But for a 15-page undergraduate paper, 10 articles was fine, and I probably cleared that with the instructor, and if not, then I should have. Anyway, the point is, the Washington Post then and also now is usually thought of as a kind of liberal-leaning paper. So if any mainstream media outlet was going to be sympathetic to members of a minority group causing a disruption to demand fair treatment, if any media was going to be sympathetic towards that, the Washington Post would likely be that source. And indeed, a lot of the coverage was sympathetic. But at the same time, it was also paternalistic, kind of condescending, in part because deafness is commonly seen as a disability. The point in this section was that the protesters did a very good job of negotiating all of what I just described, kind of figuring out how to handle the media in light of the fact that, some outlets will probably be sympathetic, but at the same time condescending. And they kind of used that dynamic to their advantage, even though they knew for sure that some of this coverage would maybe not paint them in the best light. So here's the first paragraph of the last main section that I called Negotiating Media Coverage. And it goes, "Despite my criticisms of the Washington Post, organizers of Deaf President Now found the media helpful to their cause for the most part." One DPN organizer told Christensen and Barnard, this is one of the academic sources I cited, so I'm quoting that source, "The media have a tremendous role. They made us stronger and more effective. Without them, we probably would not have continued." And then I provide the page number citation. Again, how to do that is covered in my last video. Back to the paragraph. "Following my critical discourse analysis that described the subtle but very real paternalism of the media's coverage of Deaf President Now, the question remains, what made the media, which represents an elite group in society, cover a highly disruptive protest by marginalized people in a positive light? I argue that this happened as a result of the deaf community of Gallaudet negotiating their relationship with the media. Mainstream perceptions of deafness, the deaf community's solidarity with other marginalized groups, and a skillful manipulation of the opposition all factored into this negotiation prominently and will be explored." It's actually not a very good paragraph, and this is part of why I chose this paper, because I did okay but not excellent on it. I wanted to highlight the strengths and the weaknesses. And this paragraph is one of the weaknesses. It contains a lot of important information. It's important that we know about how the mainstream tends to view deafness, and it's important to know that the DPN protesters had a lot of support from members of other marginalized groups. And it's important to know that they were good at dealing with the media. But the thing is, in terms of an essay and getting marks on an essay, I've already said most of that, so it's a bit repetitive. A lot of what's in here may have been better off in one of the other two main sections. So on that note, it's an example of how you don't necessarily have to have 3 sections. It could have been 2, it could have been 4. The structure is kind of flexible according to what you need and what fits your data. But 3 is good to have in mind, at least at the start. What probably happened, it's a long time ago, I can't remember, writing this paper really, but what probably happened is I was probably writing this on a tight deadline, like, everyone always is, and I had to just make some quick decisions and go with them. So another reason why it's a very good but not an excellent paper, I probably didn't give myself enough time to structure it properly, and I just had to go with this 3 main point structure, and I ended up with a third point that was, not that strong on its own. So to review so far, the structure of a good undergraduate essay is kind of similar to the structure of a high school 5-paragraph essay. It's just longer and much better done. A lot of these principles also apply to academic writing at all levels. So if you look at an academic journal article in a top-tier peer-reviewed source, there's usually one main argument to the article. It's usually very complex, so it might take a whole paragraph to explain it. But there's still a main argument somewhere. And then the paper is usually organized into sections, 2 or 3 or 4, sometimes 5 main sections. Each one of those sections makes a more specific point that the author then uses to prove the overall argument. A full-length academic book or a PhD dissertation, so 300 or so pages of academic prose, it's kind of the same, except with chapters. So chapter 1 introduces the study, and at some point it states the aim or the argument of the whole piece. And then each chapter, 5, 6, 10 chapters, each one of those makes a particular point that focuses on one aspect of that argument. And then there's a concluding chapter that ties everything together. So in other words, it's like a 300-page version of a 5-paragraph essay. This next section is on paragraph structure, another very common problem. So I'm hoping to save myself some writing in the margins of lots of papers by saying this. There's a few different ways of summarizing what a good paragraph contains. Often these are acronyms, which I find really annoying. I used to hate this because I used to think, university students are not 9-year-olds that need like cute acronyms to remember stuff. So I don't use these. I don't like them, but they happen to correspond to good ideas. One of them is PEAS, P-E-A-S, point, evidence, analysis, and so what, which I find really obnoxious. Almost as bad as PEAL, point, evidence, explain, link, P-E-L-L, P-E-E-L, PEAL. This stuff really irritates me. I never understood the value of turning essay advice into words that, have nothing to do with writing essays. So I find these ones annoying, patronizing, even though they happen to be correct. The one I prefer is very concise and simple, point, proof, significance. It doesn't have a cute acronym, but it describes exactly what you have to do with a paragraph. So let's go with that one. Your paragraph should start with the point, a sentence or maybe 2 sentences that tell the reader what the paragraph is about. In other words, the point in that paragraph. It could be 1 or 2 sentences, doesn't matter as long as it's concise. That first part, the point, that needs to be 100% in your own words, and it needs to be your own original thought. So one common piece of advice I give is never begin a paragraph with a quote or with a piece of data taken from another source. I think some students think this makes things look dramatic or cool to begin with this like cold intro, like straight to a fact from somewhere else. But don't do that. Always start a paragraph with your own thought, your own sentence. That's one of the most common pieces of advice that I give in undergraduate papers. Once you've done that, you've made the point. Now you have to prove it. So, proof is the next step in this structure of a good paragraph. This is where you do include quotes or data from other sources. The proof part is essential. Without it, the paragraph is useless. So back up the point that you're making with data from one of your sources or commentary from one of the experts in your sources, and always cite that with the page number. And again, that's covered in the last instructional. That's proof. And then finally, significance. One last sentence that explains why this data matters in terms of your overall argument. So this is the so what part of the PEAS, the PEAS model, but I refuse to call it that because I hate cute acronyms. So here's an example of a pretty good essay paragraph. This is not professional writing, but it did the job in a second-year undergraduate paper. This comes from the critical discourse analysis section of the paper, the one in which I looked at 10 newspaper articles about these protests, and I used what I found to support my argument that the relationship between this deaf protest movement and the media, that relationship was one of negotiation. So here's that paragraph. I'll just take a minute to read it. It goes, "The articles, though at times glorifying the protesters, tend to assume that the generosity of certain powerful politicians was an important factor that contributed to the president's resignation and the success of Deaf President Now. Thus, a movement of deaf people required stamps of approval from powerful hearing people to be successful." Molly Sinclair and Eric Pianen's March 9th, 1988 article, which was called "Protests May Imperil Gallaudet Funding. Some Members of Congress Back Movement for Deaf President." That article provides an example of this rhetorical theme. The article foregrounds comments by, I won't mention the names, a member of Congress and a Gallaudet board member who was quoted as saying, "I'm concerned that it has the potential to hurt the funding of the university, especially when you have leaders from both parties going out of their way to express themselves on this." Those leaders included, it names a couple of politicians. And then my paragraph concludes with, my own thought: "The fact that Gallaudet was still closed by student protests is relegated to the background." So the point in this paragraph is very clear in that first sentence. And just to review, that point was the articles, though at times glorifying the protesters, tend to assume that the generosity of certain powerful politicians was an important factor that contributed to the president's resignation and the success of DPN. Thus, a movement of deaf people required stamps of approval from powerful hearing people to be successful. So I think I did a reasonably good job with that one. It's a good example of negotiation. The Washington Post in this coverage was generally supportive, but at the same time kind of patronizing. In this case, it took me 2 sentences to make the point, which is fine because both sentences are concise and on target. The only problem really is in the second sentence, the one that says a movement of deaf people required stamps of approval from powerful hearing people to be successful. The way I've written that, it sounds like I think that, but I don't think that, and I didn't think it in 2002 when I wrote this either. I was trying to say that the media coverage implied this was the case, that a movement needs stamps of approval from powerful people to be successful. I didn't think that. I was trying to say the media seems to think that, so I should have made that point a lot more clear. That covers the point part of the paragraph. Then comes the proof. I quote one of the articles which focuses on how a couple of politicians support the movement, and I provide a good amount of detail for that. And then I wrap up the paragraph with significance, which goes, the fact that Gallaudet was still closed by student protests is relegated to the background, which explains how all of this data here supports my argument that the relationship between the protest movement and the media was about negotiation. So the article was very focused on what a couple of politicians had said, as if what those politicians said was what really began this process of change, and not the fact that, hundreds, maybe even thousands of students were taking great risks by shutting down the university campus. So in my view, the article was supportive, but also kind of condescending at the same time. And to review that last sentence, the one that explains the significance, that also needs to be 100% your own thought in your own words. Never end a paragraph with a quote or a paraphrase either. There's one important exception to the structure that I just showed you, and that exception is introductory paragraphs. That could be the first paragraph of the whole essay or the first paragraph of each specific section. Those don't need proof in them. So, for example, let's look again at the paragraph that introduced my critical discourse analysis section. It's on the screen here. I'm not going to repeat. I'm not going to read it again. But the point is, you can hit pause and look at it again if you feel you need to. The point I'm trying to make is that there's no proof in that paragraph. I haven't cited anything. It's all my own words, my own thoughts. And in this case, that's okay, because the proof is coming. I'm just introducing the section. The next 3 pages of the essay were full of the proof that I need. So this paragraph does not need the proof. Every other paragraph needs some proof somewhere in it. Last thing I'll say about paragraphs is that length and focus are two more common problems, very common problems that I write, that I note in my edits on the sidebars of students' papers. Very long paragraph is a common one. A paragraph needs to make one point and make it very well. So the number of sentences varies, but as a general guideline, I say that a paragraph should be between 1/2 and 2/3 of a standard double-spaced page. If a paragraph is shorter than that, it's probably inadequate. Either you haven't given enough proof or you haven't done enough work to link that proof to your argument. So if you see a paragraph in your paper that is less than half a page long, read it again, go back and check for all the things that I covered a couple of minutes ago, point, proof, significance, make sure each one is thorough and clear and well done. If your paragraph is longer than 2/3 of a page, you're probably not being concise enough, and or you're trying to do too much in one paragraph. So I advise the first step to be read it over, look for words and sentences that don't really add any meaning and get rid of them if you can. And then consider whether the paragraph is actually making more than one point, because a common mistake I see is paragraphs that make 2 or 3 points that are closely related, but they're still separate points. So if the paragraph is otherwise well written, but it fills, almost a whole page or more, it should never fill more than one page for sure. If that's the case, it is probably better off being 2 or 3 separate paragraphs. So read it over and see where you might be making more than one point in one paragraph and separate them out. So on that note, another kind of inside tip for those who have made it to, almost the end of this video. The first thing I do is look at the bibliography. The second thing I do when marking an essay is I flip through the pages and I check for how long the paragraphs tend to be. So if the paragraphs are more than 2/3 of a page, or if they're less than half a page, then it gives me a sense of what some of the problems might be, what to look out for as I mark the paper. Alright, lastly, some general points on the purpose of essays and some final pieces of advice based on my 16 years of grading undergraduate papers. Why do we make you write essays? The point of an essay is for you to show that you've been consuming the knowledge that's been presented to you in that course, and that you're able to use that knowledge to make a logical argument about your own topic, or in some cases a topic that's been given to you. But the point is, you're just using course material to make a logical argument. The point is not to pose like you're a true expert on the topic, or that you have everything about it figured out, or that your essay is the objective truth about that topic. A lot of students seem to think that is the goal of papers, and assuming that they are wrong, but it's not entirely their fault. I'll say a little bit about where that misconception comes from and what I think the true purpose of essays are. If you've taken my courses, you already know that I'm not a fan of the concept of objectivity in the social sciences. Now, obviously, facts are real, and we need to document them and inform ourselves with them, and good research methodology is crucial. None of that is up for debate. But the thing is, the peer review process in academic literature, peer review usually takes care of those things. Not always. There are important exceptions. But for the most part, peer review filters out anything that is based on sloppy research or that takes, an extreme ideological position without justifying it. Peer review is not perfect, but it's pretty good, and we can usually count on it to filter out stuff that is, obviously useless. But the point is, every researcher has an identity, every researcher has lived experiences, has their own political positions, and that might not shape what they find in doing research, but it will shape, why they did the study and how they packaged their findings. And it could also shape their findings. So the point is, there is no one objective truth about the Deaf President Now protests that my undergraduate paper addressed. There are facts about the protests. It happened on certain dates, it involved a certain number of people, and we can find that factual information in the archives, and the facts are important. But as for the significance of those facts, there are many different perspectives on that, and no one is in a position to offer the one objective account of that or any other event. So two people who were at the same place and at the same time will likely interpret things at least a little bit differently, especially when things are controversial. So, as my favorite historian Howard Zinn likes to say, you can't be neutral on a moving train. Not just with politically controversial topics, any topic of study. The same, two researchers could go to the same place at the same time and find two different things. Nobody has like a monopoly on the truth or being objective. Now, as for how that rant on objectivity filters down into essay writing advice, well, on one level, I hope this minimizes some anxiety that students feel as to where to get started, because, again, your job is not to say everything about the topic or to uncover the objective truth about it. It's to provide one reasonable perspective on that topic based on your own research and on the course material. Next piece of advice has to do with the choices that you make as the writer of the essay. More specifically, if you take any of my courses, always write in the first person. So write, I will argue and my argument will. Always the first person. That's my very strong preference. It's kind of standard across most of anthropology, which is what I teach most of the time. And the reason why I prefer the first person is because what you're presenting is your argument. It's not the absolute truth. It's your argument. So own it and call it your argument. The idea of writing essays in the third person is based on an approach that assumes that it's possible to come up with one objective truth about something, and that undergraduates are doing that in writing a 10-page paper based on 6 sources. And in my opinion, that is a fantasy, and frankly, it's ridiculous. Writing in the third person also can make you long-winded and unclear whether or not you're trying to be. It leads to these awkward phrases like, it will be argued that, and this essay will prove that. So please don't do that in my courses. It's your essay. You're one person with one take on the subject. So like I said, own that, be clear about it, and make your point. But like I said, every instructor has their own standards, and for reasons that I will never understand, some instructors in the social sciences still want students to write in the third person. Not my preference, but my opinions won't help you there. Just find out your instructor's preference and follow their rules in their course. And finally, the last point is nuance. I was always especially bad at this. I don't think I even understood the concept of nuance until I got to like year 2 of my master's program. The point is, even though you're making an argument, it's okay to also acknowledge that life is complicated and there's multiple perspectives on things. So you can give a kind of respectful nod to interpretations that differ from yours. Or if you find data or commentary that doesn't quite undermine your argument but doesn't fully support it either, you should mention that somewhere and say that that's the case, and include your own thoughts on it. Just to say something like, even though my argument is supported by all the rest of this data, here's something I'd like to look into further in my other research, something along those lines. Doing that is okay. Like I said, it's acknowledging complexity. It's acknowledging that life and society are full of gray areas and, as I said, nuance. So it's good to acknowledge that. But if you find data that does, completely undermine your argument, then you probably need to rethink your argument. But this shouldn't be a problem if you did a good job of the first important stage, reading your sources, taking notes, and structuring your essay at the beginning of the process. So that's where I will end this one. Thanks for watching. Any questions, comments, concerns, you can email me, 416anthropology@gmail.com, or you can leave your questions, comments, and concerns in the comment section.